Memphis, early 1970s. The night pressed heavy with heat, the kind that made the asphalt shimmer even after dark. Neon signs flickered along Beale Street, their glow mixing with cigarette smoke and the distant hum of traffic. Behind the recording studio, a black limousine waited, its engine low, while fans clustered at the back gate, calling, reaching, desperate to catch even a glimpse of the king. Elvis pushed through the door, shoulders weary from hours in the studio. His rhinestone suit caught the light, dazzling the crowd, though his face betrayed exhaustion. Still, he lifted a hand in a small wave, an instinct of kindness he could never quite suppress. Cameras flashed, voices surged, and in the chaos, no one noticed the slip. A worn black wallet tumbling quietly from his pocket onto the cracked pavement. It was no ordinary wallet. Inside, among bills and scraps of paper, lay a faded photograph of his mother, Gladys, her smile frozen in time, alongside a tiny folded note she had written him years ago. To Elvis, it was more than leather and money. It was a tether to the woman who had shaped him, the talisman he carried through fame, loneliness, and doubt. By the time the limousine door shut and the car pulled away, the wallet lay forgotten under the dim glow of a streetlight. The crowd's cheers masked its fall. But what had slipped onto that hot Memphis pavement was not just a possession. It was a piece of Elvis Presley's soul. Let us know where you're watching from. And we hope you enjoy the story. The morning heat in Memphis was already beginning to rise, though the streets still carried the coolness of night. A faint mist clung to the narrow alley behind the recording studio, where broken bottles glimmered among scraps of paper and cigarette butts. Rats had scattered at the first signs of dawn, leaving behind only silence and the echo of distant traffic on Union Avenue. In that silence, a figure stirred. A man, thin to the point of looking hollow, sat slumped against a brick wall, wrapped in a filthy army jacket. His boots were worn so thin the soles had nearly peeled away. A rusted chain around his neck held a small metal tag, his service number. The tag clinked faintly each time he shifted, the sound oddly sharp against the stillness of the alley. His beard had grown wild, his hair hung in greasy clumps, and his eyes, though clouded by exhaustion, still carried a restless alertness. The eyes of a man who had once slept in foxholes and counted every sound as possible danger. He had been back from Vietnam for almost 2 years, though back was not the right word. His return had felt more like falling through a trap door into another kind of war. One without uniforms, without orders, but no less merciless. He had come home to find that his job at the car plant had vanished. His wife had left him with their child, and the government checks were never enough to keep a roof over his head. Night after night, he drifted through Memphis like a ghost no one wanted to see. That morning, his hunger gnawed more sharply than usual. He hadn't eaten since the previous afternoon, and his stomach twisted in protest. He bent forward, pressing a hand to his side, when his eye caught something lying against the trash bins. At first, he thought it was just another discarded billfold, the sort of empty husk people tossed away when it was no use anymore. But as he reached for it, the weight told him it was full. A wallet. Leather. Worn but solid. He turned it over in his hands. The initials on the corner were pressed deep into the hide. E.P. He opened it cautiously, his fingers trembling slightly. Inside was a fold of bills, crisp 20s, maybe more money than he had seen in months. His throat went dry. But what stopped him cold was not the cash. It was the photograph tucked behind the bills. A young man, his arm around a woman with kind eyes and a soft smile. The young man's face was unmistakable, even in the faded picture. Elvis Presley. The veteran's breath caught. He blinked, as if the image might be a trick of exhaustion. But no, it was him. The boy from Tupelo who had become the king of rock and roll. The same man whose voice had once drifted over the jungle radio in Vietnam, lifting soldiers out of mud and fear, if only for 3 minutes at a time. He flipped through the wallet, careful not to smudge the photograph. A folded note slipped out, worn from years of being opened and closed. The handwriting was delicate, almost maternal. He read only a few words. "Proud of you. Love always, Mama." His chest tightened. This wasn't just a wallet. It was something personal, sacred. And yet, the hunger gnawed again. The money could buy him food for weeks, maybe even a room at a boarding house, a few nights of sleep in a real bed. The temptation pulsed in his veins, whispering, "Take it. No one will know. You deserve it. You've given enough to a country that forgot you." He sat on the curb, clutching the wallet, torn in two. His hands shook so badly that one of the bills almost slipped free. He stuffed it back inside, cursing under his breath. His mind replayed the faces of men he'd lost in the war, friends who had never come home. They had fought believing in honor, in the difference between right and wrong. Could he spit on their memory by stealing from a man he knew, deep down, had meant no harm? Minutes dragged on. The world around him brightened as the city awoke. The buzz of car engines, the clang of garbage trucks, the distant chatter of early morning pedestrians. Still he sat there, staring at the wallet as if it might tell him what to do. Finally, with a shuddering breath, he pushed the bills back in place and snapped it shut. His decision was made. He would return it. Somehow. He stood, brushing dust from his jacket. The recording studio loomed at the end of the alley, its doors busy with crewmen hauling cables and equipment. He walked slowly toward the entrance, his heart pounding louder with every step. When he reached the gate, 2 burly men in dark suits blocked his path. "I need to speak to Mr. Presley," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. He held out the wallet, careful to keep it visible. The guards exchanged a glance. One sneered. "Get lost." "It's his," the veteran insisted. "I found it right here last night. Look, his picture's inside." The other guard stepped forward, pushing him back roughly. "I said beat it, buddy. You think you can scam us with some fake wallet? You junkies come up with new tricks every day." The veteran stumbled but held tight to the leather case. Anger flared in his chest, but also shame. To them, he was nothing more than a liar, another vagrant trying to hustle a star. He opened his mouth to protest, to explain, but his words died in the noise of a passing truck. The guards turned their backs on him, dismissing him as if he were invisible. He stood frozen, humiliation burning his cheeks. He could walk away now, slip back into the alleys, keep the wallet, use the money, and no one would ever know. The city would swallow him whole again, as it always had. But he couldn't. The photograph, the note from Elvis's mother, they weighed heavier than the cash. He clutched the wallet to his chest, muttering to himself, "Not like this. Not today." And with that, he turned and walked into the streets of Memphis, carrying not only the wallet, but the heavy burden of what to do next. The city had already awakened fully when the veteran drifted away from the studio gates. Morning sunlight reflected off shop windows, catching in the chrome of parked cars and the polished shoes of businessmen hurrying along Beale Street. The smell of fried dough and bacon wafted from diners, stabbing at his empty stomach. He kept the wallet close inside his jacket, as though it were a fragile bird he had sworn to protect. He walked aimlessly for a while, weaving between people who never looked him in the eye. To them, he was just another shadow clinging to the edges of Memphis. The voices in his head wrestled. Find a way to return it. Don't give them another reason to call you a thief. Yet another, darker whisper answered, No one cares what you do. They'll only laugh at you. By mid-afternoon, he found himself pushing through the door of a neighborhood bar, the kind of place where time seemed to stand still. A haze of cigarette smoke hung beneath the low ceiling. The jukebox in the corner spilled out familiar chords. Elvis's voice, smooth and aching, singing, "We can't go on together," with suspicious minds. The irony wasn't lost on him. Heads turned briefly as he entered, then turned back to their drinks. He approached the counter, where a heavy-set bartender polished a glass without looking up. "Sir," the veteran began, his tone cautious, "I need help. This belongs to Elvis Presley. I found it last night. I'm trying to get it back to him." He placed the wallet on the counter, letting the initials glint in the dim light. The bartender squinted, then chuckled harshly. "Yeah, sure it does. And I'm the president." He pushed the wallet back with 2 fingers, as though it were contaminated. "Listen, old-timer, I've seen every trick in the book. You think you can score a few bucks claiming you found the king's billfold? Try that on someone else." Heat surged up the veteran's neck. "I'm not lying," he said, voice trembling but firm. "There's a note in there, a photograph. I haven't taken a thing." The bartender laughed louder, catching the attention of a few regulars. "Hey, fellas, this one says he's doing charity work for Elvis now." A roar of laughter broke out at the back table. The veteran's jaw tightened. He reached for the wallet, but a man at the end of the bar, a broad-shouldered fellow with a red face from drink, stood and staggered closer. "What's this about Presley?" the man slurred. He eyed the veteran up and down, sneering. "Looks to me like you swiped it. Probably lifted it right off him while he was busy signing autographs. Folks like you are always stealing." The insult cut deeper than he expected. Before he could answer, the man shoved him in the chest. The veteran stumbled back, colliding with a chair. Gasps rose as drinks spilled across the floor. His body tensed, instincts from the battlefield roaring back. He raised his fists, though he didn't want to fight. "Thief!" the drunk shouted again, grabbing at the wallet. The veteran twisted away, panic surging. A scuffle erupted, chairs screeched, a glass shattered. Someone shouted for them to take it outside. The veteran ducked under a swinging arm, his mind flashing with the chaos of Saigon streets. His heart hammered as if he were under fire again. With a desperate push, he broke free and stumbled toward the door. He burst into the daylight, gasping, clutching the wallet like a lifeline. His whole body shook. The humiliation of being mocked, the sting of being branded a criminal, it nearly crushed the fragile resolve he had left. He leaned against the brick wall outside, sweat soaking through his shirt despite the mild breeze. He thought about disappearing again, slipping back into alleys where no one would follow. But then a voice, gentle yet familiar, called his name. He froze. From the corner of the street emerged a man carrying a battered guitar case. His hair was streaked with gray, but his gait carried the rhythm of someone who had lived inside music. Recognition came slowly. It was an old acquaintance from Memphis's music scene, one of the men who had once played at Sun's studio during the early days, when Elvis himself had been just another hopeful. The musician's eyes widened as he took in the veteran's appearance. "Lord above, I thought you didn't make it back from Nam," he said softly. The veteran could hardly form words. "Barely did," he muttered. He held up the wallet with shaking hands. I found this. It's Presley's. No one believes me. They think I'm running a scam." The musician stepped closer, studying the wallet carefully. His expression shifted from doubt to realization. That's his. All right. I'd know those initials anywhere. He looked the veteran in the eye, his voice firm. You did the right thing bringing it back. Don't let these fools tell you otherwise. Relief flooded through the veteran like a sudden rainstorm. For the first time since dawn, someone believed him. The musician clapped a hand on his shoulder. Come with me, he said. I still know a few people around Graceland. If anybody can get this back to Elvis, it's me. The veteran nodded, though his body still trembled from the fight inside. He followed, step unsteady, but spirit a little less crushed. For the first time in years, he felt the faint stirrings of hope. Thin, fragile, but alive. The veteran and his old musician acquaintance walked side by side through the bustling streets of Memphis. Afternoon shadows stretched long, the sun hanging low and fierce, throwing the sidewalks into alternating strips of glare and shade. The guitar case bumped gently against the musician's leg as they moved, his steps calm and steady, in stark contrast to the veteran's restless gait. The wallet remained pressed against the veteran's chest, inside his jacket. Each heartbeat reminded him of the burden he carried, part hope, part curse. They turned down a quieter avenue, where brick storefronts gave way to wide boulevards lined with tall oaks. Cars idled at the lights, radios spilling out the familiar drawl of DJs announcing Presley's latest single. The city itself seemed wrapped in the singer's presence. Everywhere they went, his voice hummed from speakers, his face stared from posters, his name flickered in neon. To the veteran, it felt almost unreal. He held a piece of that world, yet belonged to none of it. The musician had promised to reach out to someone in Presley's circle, but before any arrangement could be made, fate intervened. At the far end of the street, a sleek black limousine rolled slowly into view, its chrome gleaming under the fading sunlight. Pedestrians stopped mid-step, whispering, pointing. There was no mistaking who rode inside. The veteran froze, his breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected to see Elvis here, not like this, not so suddenly. It was as if the city itself had conspired to close the distance between them. The limousine slowed near the curb, preparing to turn. A small crowd began to gather, drawn as always by the magnetism of celebrity. The veteran, caught between instinct and duty, stepped forward hesitantly. The wallet seemed to burn inside his jacket. This was his chance. Before he could take another step, two bodyguards emerged from the sidewalk shadows. They moved quickly, intercepting him as if they had been watching all along. One grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back. The veteran cried out, the sudden pressure igniting sharp pain in his shoulder. "Stay back," one of the guards barked. "No closer to the car." The veteran struggled. "Wait! This belongs to him. It's his wallet." He fumbled to pull it from his jacket, desperate to prove his words. But the gesture only convinced them further he was a threat. The second guard lunged, shoving him hard against a lamppost. The wallet slipped from his grasp, spinning through the air before hitting the pavement with a dull thud. Gasps rippled through the bystanders. The veteran's knees buckled as he fought to stay upright, humiliation washing over him once more. "Let me go," he shouted, voice hoarse. "I'm not a thief." His words were swallowed by the commotion, the crowd murmuring, the guards tightening their hold. And then, above the noise, a window of the limousine lowered. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Elvis Presley himself leaned forward, his expression one of curiosity and concern. His eyes fell first on the scuffle, then on the object lying on the ground. The wallet. "Stop!" Elvis's voice cut through the chaos, firm yet calm. The bodyguards froze, stunned into silence. "Let him go." Reluctantly, the guards released their grip. The veteran staggered, clutching his bruised arm, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. He glanced toward the pavement. The wallet lay there, exposed, vulnerable. Elvis opened the limousine door and stepped out, his presence commanding without effort. He bent down, picked up the wallet, and turned it in his hands. For an instant, his face was unreadable. But then recognition dawned. He looked from the wallet to the veteran, who stood trembling in front of him, sweat dripping down his temple, eyes wide with a mix of fear and defiance. The two men locked eyes. One face weathered by war and loss, the other lined with the weariness of fame and responsibility. For several long seconds, no one spoke. The murmurs of the crowd faded into silence, as if the entire street was holding its breath. Elvis broke the silence first. "You found this?" His voice was soft, almost disbelieving. The veteran swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Yes," he managed. "I found it behind the studio last night. I didn't take a dime. It's yours." The sincerity in his voice was raw, stripped of any pretense. Elvis studied him, his gaze searching for any trace of deceit, but instead found only exhaustion and a kind of battered honesty. The guards shifted uneasily nearby, their earlier aggression now awkward under their employer's watchful eye. Elvis nodded slowly, slipping the wallet into his jacket. "Then we need to talk," he said. His tone carried neither suspicion nor judgment, only quiet gravity. He gestured to the limousine. The crowd parted as though commanded by some invisible force, whispering in astonishment. The veteran, still shaken, glanced at the musician who had brought him this far. The man gave an encouraging nod. With hesitant steps, the veteran moved toward the limousine. Each stride felt like crossing a bridge he hadn't known existed, one that spanned the gulf between despair and the faint possibility of redemption. He climbed inside, the heavy door shutting behind him, sealing off the outside world. The noise of the city dimmed, replaced by the muted hum of the car's engine. For the first time, he sat across from Elvis Presley, the man whose music had once filled the jungles of Vietnam. The man whose wallet had led him here. Their eyes met again in the quiet interior. The weight of the moment pressed down, neither man speaking. Outside, the limousine began to roll forward, leaving behind the stunned crowd and the lingering echo of what had just unfolded. The limousine doors closed with a muffled thud, sealing off the noise of Memphis. The sudden hush inside was almost startling. After the chaos of the street, the interior felt like another world entirely. Cool air whispered from hidden vents, carrying the faint scent of leather and cologne. The seats were wide, soft, and spotless, a stark contrast to the grime clinging to the veteran's jacket. He sat stiffly on the edge, his shoulders hunched, as though afraid that leaning back would leave a mark. Elvis settled across from him, resting one arm casually on the seat, the other still holding the recovered wallet. His eyes, however, weren't casual. They were intent, focused, studying the man before him with a quiet patience. For a long moment, neither spoke. The low purr of the engine filled the silence, punctuated only by the muted rattle of the city outside the tinted glass. Finally, the veteran broke the stillness. His voice was low, unsteady. I didn't take anything. You can count it if you want." Elvis's gaze softened. "I already know you didn't." He turned the wallet in his hands, opening it briefly, then closing it again with care. "The picture, the note, they're still here. You could have sold this to anyone, but you didn't." The veteran's eyes dropped to the floor, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "I thought about it. Lord knows I did. But his voice caught. I saw her words. Your mama. I couldn't take from that. Not from her. For the first time, a flicker of surprise crossed Elvis's face. He pressed the wallet against his chest, almost reflexively, as though the memory within it had grown heavier. That note, he murmured. I've carried it since she passed. There were nights I'd read it just to keep going. His tone was steady, but his eyes glistened faintly, betraying the depth of that private loss. The veteran nodded, understanding more than he could say. He drew in a slow breath, then began to speak in broken fragments. Vietnam, 2 tours, came home to nothing. The noise in my head never stops. Wife, gone. Kid, too. Nowhere to land. I sleep where I can. His words faltered, tangled by shame. Elvis leaned forward slightly, his posture open, not rushing him. You were in Nam? Yes. The veteran's voice carried a dull edge, the tone of a man who had repeated the fact too many times without ever being heard. Left half my life over there. Elvis let the words settle before speaking again. I've sung to a lot of soldiers. Met them at bases, hospitals. But most folks back home, they don't understand what you carried back. The veteran's jaw clenched, his eyes darting toward the floor again. They see a bum on the street, not a man who served, not a man who bled. He tugged at the chain around his neck, the dog tag flashing briefly in the dim light. This is all I got left that proves I was ever anyone. Elvis studied the tag, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, slowly, he spoke a name, one the veteran hadn't heard in years. You're Carter, aren't you? Lived off Lamar Avenue. Older brother named James. The veteran's head snapped up, startled. How do you know that? Elvis smiled faintly, a rare warmth breaking through his guarded composure. When I was just a kid, I used to haul groceries from the store back to my mama. Your brother James helped me more than once when the bags were too heavy. Told me to keep my chin up, that better days were coming. He shook his head, as if marveling at the coincidence. Funny how the world circles back. The veteran blinked, struggling to process it. His mind replayed faint memories of his brother talking about a shy kid from the neighborhood who sang at church gatherings, the one everyone underestimated. That boy was now sitting across from him, the most famous man in America, speaking with a kind of quiet gratitude that felt impossibly sincere. Emotion swelled in the veteran's chest, unexpected and overwhelming. He pressed his palms against his knees, grounding himself. James, he passed a few years ago, he said softly. Elvis lowered his eyes, his features tightening briefly in respect. I'm sorry to hear that. He was a good man, helped a boy who had nothing feel like he wasn't alone. Silence filled the limousine again, but it was no longer heavy. It was contemplative, shared. 2 men, different in nearly every way, yet bound for a moment by threads of memory, loss, and unspoken understanding. Elvis leaned back, slipping the wallet carefully into his jacket pocket. You brought me something I never wanted to lose. Not the money, not the leather. Her words. He tapped his chest lightly. You gave that back to me. The veteran swallowed hard. His throat ached with unshed words. About hunger, despair, nights of cold pavement. But none of it seemed necessary now. For the first time in years, someone wasn't looking through him, but at him. Outside, the city roared on, unaware of the quiet exchange unfolding in the back of a moving limousine. Inside, a fragile bridge had formed between a fallen soldier and a king, a bridge no one else would ever witness. The limousine glided through Memphis streets, its tinted windows shielding the two men from curious eyes outside. For a time, neither spoke. Elvis leaned back, lost in his own thoughts, while the veteran sat rigid, still uneasy in the plush interior. The wallet rested safely in Elvis's pocket now, yet its presence hung between them like a reminder of all that had been revealed. Finally, Elvis shifted forward, his voice quiet but deliberate. "You know," he said, "people think a man like me has everything. Money, cars, crowds cheering wherever I go. But they don't see the nights when the house is quiet, and all I can hear is the echo of my own thoughts." He paused, his gaze fixed not on the veteran, but on the city blurring past the window. "After Mama died, I thought I'd never feel whole again. Some days, even now, I still don't." The veteran watched him closely, surprised at the openness. He had expected distance, a wall of celebrity pride. Instead, the king of rock and roll was confessing a wound not so different from his own. "I can't hand you a stack of bills and pretend it'll fix what you've been through," Elvis continued. "I've seen too many men broken that way, paid off and forgotten. That's not what you deserve." The veteran's lips parted, uncertain what to say. He had imagined being tossed a few dollars, maybe a pat on the back, then sent on his way. What Elvis was saying unsettled him, but in a way that stirred something deeper than relief. Without warning, Elvis leaned toward the driver. "Take us to the VA hospital," he ordered. The chauffeur glanced in the mirror, startled. "At this hour, sir?" "Right now." Elvis's tone left no room for argument. The guards exchanged uneasy looks, clearly baffled. One leaned in. "Boss, you sure about this? Press might notice." "Let them," Elvis said firmly. "Drive." The veteran shifted uncomfortably. "You don't need to do this," he muttered, his voice laced with nerves. Elvis met his eyes. "I want to." The limousine turned sharply, weaving through traffic. Neon lights streaked across the glass, the city sliding into a darker, quieter quarter. The veteran's pulse quickened as the looming outline of the hospital came into view. Memories pressed in, smells of antiseptic, endless waiting rooms, doctors who looked at him like a statistic instead of a man. He swallowed hard, bracing himself. The car pulled up to the front entrance. Nurses and orderlies froze in disbelief as Elvis Presley stepped out first, his presence drawing gasps even in this somber place. He gestured for the veteran to follow. The man hesitated, then obeyed, his boots heavy on the pavement. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Patients sat in wheelchairs along the corridor, their eyes widening as they recognized the visitor. Elvis moved with calm assurance, ignoring the startled whispers. He placed a steadying hand on the veteran's shoulder and guided him forward. At the reception desk, the head nurse blinked rapidly, struggling to compose herself. "Mr. Presley, what brings you?" Elvis raised his voice so that everyone nearby could hear. "This man is a soldier. He served in Vietnam. He gave more to this country than most will ever understand. Last night, he found something of mine, something I treasure more than gold, and he returned it without touching a dollar. That's honor. That's a hero." The words echoed through the sterile hallway, silencing the murmurs. The veteran stood frozen, face flushed, eyes downcast. Just hours ago, guards had shoved him aside like a nuisance. Now, in front of staff and strangers, Elvis Presley was declaring his worth aloud. The effect was immediate. Nurses who had glanced at him with suspicion now softened, offering nods of respect. An orderly stepped forward, pulling out a chair for him. Even a doctor, adjusting his glasses nervously, extended a hand. "Thank you for your service," he said, voice sincere. The veteran's throat tightened. He had gone so long without hearing those words, He almost forgot what they sounded like. Elvis remained beside him, calm but resolute. "He doesn't need pity," he said to the staff. "He needs care. The kind you'd give your own brother." The nurse nodded quickly, scribbling notes, already treating the veteran with a formality he hadn't known in years. The veteran turned his head slightly, whispering so only Elvis could hear. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know me?" Elvis's reply was simple, almost hushed. "Because I know what it's like to feel invisible. And because once, a man with your last name helped me when I was just a poor kid in Tupelo. Maybe this is my way of paying that back." The veteran closed his eyes briefly, the weight of it all pressing in. The sting of humiliation he had carried from the bar, the scorn at the studio gates. It all seemed to dissolve under the warmth of this moment. For the first time in years, he felt like more than a shadow. He felt seen. The hospital lobby, sterile and cold just moments earlier, now felt like a stage where dignity was being restored. He stood straighter, the chain with his dog tag glinting under the harsh lights. For once, he didn't try to hide it. And Elvis, standing beside him, looked not like a distant star, but like a man determined to share his light where it was most needed. Morning in Memphis came with a haze of heat already pressing down on the city. The veteran awoke on a cot in the VA ward, not quite believing the night before had been real. The faint antiseptic smell, the steady beeping of machines down the hall, the soft murmur of nurses, it all told him he was still here. For the first time in years, he had slept inside four walls, not under the open sky. And it was because Elvis Presley, of all people, had insisted. But by the time he rose and dressed, reality was waiting outside the hospital doors. Newspapers were already on stands across the city, their front pages filled with headlines about Elvis and the homeless veteran. Some wrote of kindness and gratitude, but others carried a sharper edge. One local column sneered that it was nothing but a staged act of charity, a publicity stunt designed to soften Presley's image after weeks of tabloid rumors. As the veteran stood on the hospital steps, he saw photographers clustered near the gates of Graceland in the morning papers. Reporters jotted notes, their expressions skeptical, their captions laced with doubt. They didn't mention his name, only a vagrant, an unnamed drifter. His stomach knotted. The truth of what happened, the hunger, the temptation, the choice to do right, was already being twisted into a story he didn't recognize. Inside Elvis's circle, tension was rising as well. The guard who had shoved the veteran against the lamppost the night before was pacing nervously in the mansion kitchen, chain-smoking and muttering about keeping his job. He knew Elvis had seen the scuffle, had seen the wallet slip to the ground. If the newspapers dug deeper, he'd be painted as the villain in a story that was already catching fire. He tried to convince other staffers that the whole encounter should be erased, smoothed over, forgotten. The less attention, the better, he argued. Nobody wants the king tangled up with some bum. But Elvis thought differently. That afternoon, he sat in his study at Graceland, the blinds drawn against the heat. The wallet lay on the desk before him, open to the faded photograph of his mother. His fingers brushed the edges of the paper, lingering on the curve of her handwriting. Across the room, one of his aides hesitated, holding a stack of newspapers. "They're saying it was staged," the aide muttered. "Some of them think you planted him. That the guy isn't even a veteran, just an actor. The press is hungry for scandal, Elvis. Maybe it's best to let this fade." Elvis looked up sharply. "Fade? That man risked being beaten on the street just trying to hand this back to me. He could have taken the money and disappeared, but he didn't. And you want me to pretend it never happened?" His voice, though not loud, carried a weight that silenced the room. The aide shifted uneasily. "It's not just the papers. The colonel thinks it's dangerous, too. Says you should steer clear of it. Says you've got a tour coming and can't afford bad publicity." Elvis leaned back, exhaling slowly, his eyes clouded with thought. For a moment, the room was silent, except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Then he said, with quiet certainty, "If they doubt him, then I'll stand beside him myself." And so, later that day, when reporters gathered outside Graceland's gates hoping for a quote, they were stunned to see Elvis emerge, not alone, but with the veteran walking at his side. The man's clothes were still worn, his face still gaunt, but Elvis had placed his own arm lightly on his shoulder as though to say, "This man is mine to defend." Flashbulbs exploded. Questions flew through the air like arrows. Who is he? How did you meet him? Is this real or staged? The veteran flinched under the barrage, every instinct telling him to shrink back into invisibility. But Elvis squeezed his shoulder gently, steadying him. "This man found my wallet," he told the crowd. "Inside it was a picture of my mama, something I can't ever replace. He could have kept it, sold it, or left it to rot in an alley. But he didn't. He brought it back. And when I tell you he's a veteran, a man who gave his years and his strength for this country, you'd better believe me." For a moment, the courtyard went silent, the reporters blinking at the blunt force of his words. The usual smirk in their questions faded. Cameras lowered slightly. What had begun as a hunt for scandal suddenly felt like something else entirely. A reckoning with sincerity that could not be faked. The veteran's throat tightened as Elvis continued, his voice steady and clear. "This isn't a story about me. It's about him. And if you want to print something, print this. There are men walking our streets who deserve more than we've given them. Don't call him a vagrant. Call him by his name." He turned toward the veteran, giving him the floor. The man's heart pounded. For years, he had spoken to empty air, his words ignored. Now, every pen, every lens, every eye was waiting. His voice shook as he gave his name, his rank, the unit he had served with in Vietnam. The silence that followed was heavy, not with ridicule, but with gravity. For the first time in years, he felt that his words mattered. Elvis ended the moment with a simple nod. "That's all for now," he said, guiding the veteran back inside. The press clamored for more, but the message had already been sent. Inside the mansion, Elvis offered him a glass of water, his manner casual again. "They'll twist things any way they can," he admitted. "But today, they heard the truth. And sometimes, that's enough." The veteran gripped the glass tightly, his eyes burning with unspoken gratitude. He had spent years convinced his voice no longer carried weight. But now, standing beside Elvis Presley, he felt the stirrings of dignity return. By the following morning, the story had already outgrown Memphis. Radio hosts debated it on air, voices tinged with suspicion or awe. Newspapers carried conflicting accounts, some skeptical, others celebratory. But by midday, reporters were camped outside Graceland in greater numbers than ever, determined to catch Elvis himself on record. Elvis could have stayed inside, let his manager or aides handle the noise. He could have allowed the gossip to rise and fall, as so many rumors before had. Instead, he made a decision few expected. He would face the press directly, and he would not do it alone. In the foyer of the mansion, he found the veteran waiting anxiously, shifting from foot to foot like a man caught between duty and dread. His jacket, though brushed clean, still carried the marks of wear, his boots scuffed nearly white at the edges. He looked ready to bolt at any moment. "You don't have to go out there," Elvis told him gently. The veteran shook his head. "If I stay, they'll keep calling me a liar." "I can't stand that anymore." Elvis nodded once. "Then we go together." When they stepped outside, the crowd erupted in a flurry of camera flashes and shouted questions. The midday sun glared off microphones and notebook covers, but Elvis's presence cut through the frenzy like a steady flame. He lifted a hand for silence. To everyone's surprise, the noise fell quickly. "I lost something last night," he began, his voice carrying clear over the courtyard. "Not money. Not jewels. A simple wallet. Inside it was a photograph of my mama and a note she wrote me years ago. That picture is worth more to me than every Cadillac I've ever owned." He reached into his jacket, pulling the wallet out for all to see. The crowd leaned forward, expectant. Elvis opened it carefully and held up the worn photograph, its corners bent, the ink slightly faded. The murmurs of the press quieted further, as if they understood they were being shown something rare and private. "This man," Elvis continued, placing a hand on the veteran's back, "found it on the street. He could have kept the money, could have walked away, but he didn't. He gave it back, untouched. That's the kind of honesty you don't see every day." The veteran stood stiffly, eyes lowered, but Elvis wasn't finished. His voice grew more deliberate, more personal. "Some of you wrote that this was staged, that it was a trick. Look at him. Does this look like a man hired to play a part? This is a veteran of Vietnam, a man who gave his strength to this country while most of us stayed safe at home." The words struck the reporters like stones. Not long ago, they had scribbled notes about a nameless drifter. Now, confronted with his presence and Elvis's unwavering defense, their pens slowed. One reporter finally broke the silence, calling out, "Sir, what's your name?" The veteran hesitated. It had been years since anyone asked with genuine interest. His voice trembled but did not falter. He gave his full name, his rank, and his unit. For a moment, even the scribbling of pens seemed subdued, as if everyone knew they were writing down something that deserved weight. Elvis nodded. "Remember it. Because yesterday you wrote about a vagrant. Today you've heard the truth." There was no dramatic gesture, no rehearsed flourish, just a quiet conviction in his words that silenced skepticism more effectively than any press release. The crowd stood in stillness, broken only by the clicks of cameras capturing the unlikely pair, America's most famous singer and a weary soldier side by side. The veteran lifted his head slightly, meeting the stares of those who had once dismissed him. He felt a tremor of fear, but beneath it, something new. The awareness that he was being seen, truly seen, by his city for the first time since he returned from war. The press conference ended as suddenly as it had begun. Elvis gave a brief nod, slipped the photograph back into his wallet, and guided the veteran inside. Reporters shouted more questions, but he didn't look back. The message had been delivered. That evening, the city's papers carried different headlines than the day before. Where once there had been doubt, there was now admiration. One front page read, "The King calls a homeless veteran a hero." Another featured a photograph of Elvis's hand resting on the soldier's shoulder. The caption simply, "Not forgotten." For the veteran, who had spent years walking unseen through the streets of Memphis, the transformation was almost unbearable. The same passers-by who once avoided his eyes now looked at him with curiosity, even respect. Strangers nodded in greeting. Nurses at the VA called him by his name instead of just "Sir." He had not sought fame nor pity, but for the first time since returning from war, he carried something heavier than his failures. dignity restored before the eyes of all Memphis. Weeks passed, and life in Memphis seemed to settle back into its rhythm. Yet for the veteran, nothing was the same. He no longer drifted unseen through alleys. His name, once buried under years of silence, had been spoken aloud before the city, and it carried weight again. Still, he remained wary of the attention. He kept to himself, spending most nights at the VA ward, avoiding the places where he had once been scorned. One afternoon, a message arrived. Unexpected, almost unbelievable. Elvis had sent word through one of his aides. The veteran was invited to attend a concert at the Mid-South Coliseum. Not in the back rows, not hidden among the faceless crowd, but as a guest. On the night of the show, the city thrummed with energy. Cars clogged the streets near the venue, headlights flashing like restless stars. Fans in sequined shirts and wide-lapel jackets streamed toward the glowing arena, their voices buzzing with anticipation. Inside, the air was electric, thick with cigarette smoke and perfume. The roar of the audience pulsed like a living heartbeat. The veteran hesitated at the entrance, nervous in his worn jacket. He felt painfully out of place among the polished shoes, bright dresses, and glittering jewelry. But an usher approached and, with surprising deference, guided him not to the cheap seats, but to a velvet-lined section near the stage. There, to his astonishment, he found himself seated among Elvis's family and close friends. He tried to shrink into his chair, uneasy under the weight of such company, but the warmth of those around him soon eased the edge of his fear. The house lights dimmed, and a thunder of applause rose as the band struck the first notes. The curtain lifted, revealing Elvis in a dazzling white jumpsuit studded with rhinestones, bathed in golden light. The crowd erupted, a tidal wave of sound that shook the rafters. The veteran's chest tightened. He had heard Elvis's voice countless times over radios and jukeboxes, but never like this. Here, it was raw and immediate, cutting through the noise with a force that felt almost physical. Song after song rolled over the audience, some joyous, some aching with longing, and each was met with cheers and cries that seemed endless. Halfway through the set, as the frenzy swelled, Elvis paused. The band quieted, leaving a hush that spread through the hall. Elvis turned slightly toward the section where the veteran sat. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, but carried effortlessly across the stadium. "I want to sing this one for those who've seen things most of us can't imagine," he said. His eyes swept the crowd before settling briefly on the veteran. "For the men who went to war and came back carrying more than medals. And for a friend of mine who reminded me what honor looks like." The words were simple, without flourish, yet they struck the audience with unexpected weight. A ripple of silence moved through the Coliseum, followed by a swell of applause. Not frenzied this time, but warm, steady, and reverent. The veteran felt his throat constrict, his eyes burning. He lowered his head, overwhelmed, but in that moment he was not invisible. The entire arena bore witness to his existence. Then Elvis began to sing. The melody was tender, the lyrics heavy with longing and resilience. Each note seemed to lift the air itself, filling the space with something larger than sound, an unspoken acknowledgement of pain and survival. The veteran closed his eyes, letting it wash over him. For the first time since returning from Vietnam, he felt the weight on his chest loosen, if only for a song's length. When the concert ended, the crowd erupted once more, stomping, clapping, crying out for encores. The veteran sat stunned, unable to join in, as though he had been given something too sacred for applause. Backstage, after the final bow, An aide approached him with an envelope. Inside was a neatly folded letter, bearing the letterhead of a local foundation. It was an offer of assistance, temporary housing, job placement, counseling, not charity in the form of handouts, but a chance to rebuild. The letter ended with a single line, handwritten by the director. "We heard your story. Let us help write the next part." His hands shook as he folded the letter back into its envelope. He could hardly process it. A few weeks earlier, he had been a man nobody saw. Now, doors he had long believed closed forever were opening. Outside, the night air was cool, carrying the lingering hum of the crowd still spilling from the arena. The veteran stepped out quietly, clutching the envelope in one hand. For once, the future did not seem like an endless stretch of alleys and hunger. It seemed like a road. Uncertain, yes, but leading somewhere. And behind him, the music still echoed, reminding him that sometimes a single song, a single act, could change the course of a life. The Colosseum had long since emptied, the roar of the crowd reduced to faint echoes in the veteran's ears. The hallways backstage smelled of sweat, stale cigarette smoke, and hairspray. Technicians moved quietly, rolling away amps and coiling cables, their voices hushed now that the storm of performance had passed. A narrow corridor led to Elvis's dressing room. The veteran followed an aide through the dim light, his boots dragging slightly on the worn linoleum. His body was still buzzing from the electricity of the concert, but his spirit felt strangely fragile, as though he carried too much inside him to speak. The aide opened the door and stepped aside. The veteran entered slowly. Inside, the room was half lit by a single lamp. The mirror above the vanity was cluttered with makeup tins, brushes, and sweat-stained scarves tossed carelessly aside. Towels lay in piles on the floor, damp with the residue of performance. The air carried a sharp mix of cologne and perspiration, the unmistakable aftermath of the stage. Elvis sat slouched in a chair, his white jumpsuit loosened at the collar, his face glistening from exertion. His hair was damp, his hands resting limply on his knees. He looked less like the king of rock and roll and more like a man utterly spent. When he saw the veteran, however, he straightened slightly, offering a weary but genuine smile. "Did you enjoy it?" Elvis asked, his voice hoarse from singing. The veteran nodded. He tried to speak, but found his throat too tight. After a pause, he managed, "I haven't heard music like that since the war. Out there, we used to listen on little radios. Sometimes your songs were the only thing that kept us steady." Elvis's expression softened. He gestured toward a chair. "Sit down. No need to stand on ceremony here." The veteran lowered himself onto the chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two men who had already said much without words. Finally, the veteran drew in a shaky breath. "I need to tell you something." His voice trembled, low and unsteady. "The night I found your wallet, I wasn't just wandering. I was thinking about ending it. I had nothing left. No home, no family, no reason. I was ready to let go." He stopped, his eyes fixed on the floor. His confession hung heavy in the air. "But then I saw it," he continued softly. "That picture of your mama. The words she wrote you. And I thought, if something that small could mean so much, maybe there was still something worth holding on to. Returning it gave me a reason to make it to morning." His voice cracked at the last word. He swallowed hard, unable to go on. For a long time, Elvis didn't answer. His head lowered, his fingers tracing idle circles on his knee. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than the veteran had ever heard it. "Funny thing," Elvis said. You think you were saved by finding that wallet, but maybe I was saved by you bringing it back. I'd forgotten what it felt like to trust somebody without asking what they wanted in return. When you handed that to me, untouched, it reminded me there's still good left out there, that I'm not as alone as I tell myself I am. The veteran lifted his gaze. Their eyes met across the small, cluttered room, two men scarred in different ways, both weary from battles no one else could fully see. Neither was a savior, neither a saint. But in that moment, each had given the other a reason to endure. No more words were needed. Elvis leaned back, closing his eyes briefly, while the veteran sat in stillness, the weight of despair eased by something fragile but real. Outside the door, the murmur of the crew packing up faded further into the night. The city buzzed with stories of the concert, of the spectacle, of the king's voice shaking the rafters. Yet here, behind closed doors, the truest part of the evening was taking place in silence. Two men, stripped of pretense, simply sat together, breathing, remembering, enduring. And for the first time in years, the veteran felt not forgotten, not unseen, but alive.